Hello there. Now that we know the difference between ST elevation MI and non-ST elevation MI, that is transmural ischemia and subendocardial ischemia, our management will differ on the basis of how severe the ischemia is. Let us start by discussing ST elevation type of myocardial ischemia here. That is, we are talking about transmural ischemia or transmural infarction, right? So how do we manage ST elevation MI? We have already seen that ischemic heart disease, chronic stable angina, acute coronary syndrome, Prinzmetal angina, it is the acute coronary syndrome that we diagnose on the basis of clinical features that we decide to manage using the ECG. So you don't need an ECG to really distinguish between chronic stable angina and acute coronary syndrome. But once you do the ECG, the acute coronary syndrome can be subdivided into STEMI, NSTEMI and SCD. STEMI, ST elevation MI, NSTEMI, NST elevation MI, UA stands for unstable angina. You will see that NSTEMI unstable angina is a single complex. We will discuss that later. SCD is sudden cardiac death, that is the patient had a vulnerable plaque rupture and dies, usually due to an arrhythmia. Such a patient is not your prerogative. It will be managed by the pathologist. Sudden cardiac death, this is managed by the pathologist. So it's not really something that the physician is going to manage. You will be managing NSTEMI and STEMI. So let's step into that. For acute coronary syndromes, you can divide as ST elevation MI and NSTEMI, unstable angina. As I said, we will be discussing on the management of ST elevation MI because ST elevation MI usually has the maximum complications. In STEMI is much lesser complications. In STEMI, we have already discussed the complication. The most commonly there is going to be significant infarction of the pumping. So because of pump failure, you can develop left ventricular dysfunction, especially heart failure, very classical in anterior and lateral wall infarcts involving the left ventricle so that your ejection fraction goes down. Sometimes the infarcted tissue can also lead to arrhythmias because of spontaneous depolarization from the ischemic or infarcted tissue. In case the right ventricle is involved, because the right ventricle does not pump blood into the pulmonary circuit, you know that venous return decreases and there is shock. Even though the left ventricle is pumping normally, in right ventricle or inferior wall MIs, you do develop shock. Thromboembolism is classical in anterior wall MIs with severe left ventricular dysfunction or with associated atrial fibrillation. The danger with thromboembolism is that usually they embolize. Once you have thrombus within the ventricular cavity or even the atrial cavity, it embolizes to the brain, increasing the risk of strokes as well as other organ damage. Pericarditis is when the infarction can extend up to the pericardium, sometimes producing direct inflammation of the pericardium. Sometimes a delayed autoimmune type of pericarditis is also there called Dressler syndrome. In both conditions, there will be chest pain, there will be ST changes. But remember the key difference between pericarditis chest pain and myocardial infarction chest pain is pericarditis chest pain radiates to your trapezius muscle. Lastly, even though rare, a very dramatic kind of complication is the aneurysm of the left ventricle. All of these are much more commoner in ST elevation MI as compared to NST elevation MI. So we will prioritize our discussion of ST elevation MI first. Now imagine this gentleman comes to you. Okay, so imagine that he is the 62-year-old gentleman who came to you with chest pain and he says that I've been having chest pain for the last 1 hour. It looks like an angina that lasted more than an hour. What will you say? And if an angina lasted more than an hour, first thing you would say is, yes, it's an acute coronary syndrome. Probably he had a vulnerable plaque rupture. In such a gentleman, then you will have to decide whether this is an ST elevation or ST depression. So you do an ECG and you get this. Yes, you have seen that there is an ST elevation. So we have this gentleman who has come to your emergency, right, with angina, which look like an acute coronary syndrome, and ST elevation. Now, what if I ask you the question? Is it infarction or is it ischemia? In ST elevation MI, does the I stand for infarction or ischemia? Now, this is something that we had a huge argument about. Okay, so my colleagues who were present with me in the emergency started asking me, okay, come on, is this ischemia? Is this infarction? Well, you can interpret it as both really, but ultimately, what is the difference between ischemia and infarction? Infarction means dead tissue. If there is dead tissue, there are usually some things that leak out of it. Yes, you're correct. There are what are called cardiac enzymes or cardiac biomarkers. If you try and recall what these cardiac biomarkers commonly are, there are usually three of them. We use troponin, we use CPK, creatinine phosphokinase MB isoenzyme, and lastly, we sometimes used to use myoglobin. Myoglobin is extremely non-specific, so we don't use it. Instead, we use primarily troponin and CPK MB. Out of the two, which do you think is better? Yes, troponin is always the best marker, or what we call a biomarker of myocardial infarction. Troponin starts to elevate between 3 to 6 hours after a myocardial infarction. Remember that number, 3 to 6 hours after a myocardial infarction. It remains elevated for longer periods of time, usually 7 to 10 days. Look at this graph. This is your troponin. It rises within 3 to 6 hours and goes below detectable levels. That's what this line is showing you. This is the detectable level. It goes below the detectable level between 7 to 10 days. So after an infarction, it remains elevated for up to 7 days. CPK-MB is a little slower. In fact, if you look at CPK-MB, it rises between 4 to 8 hours and it remains elevated only for 3 days. Okay, so here you can see it rises a little slow. It can be 12 hours after the infarction that you have a rise in CPK, and it starts to become negative by day 3. So it's generally not a very good marker of myocardial infarction in the emergency. However, there is one situation where you prefer CPK over troponin. That is, if you have an infarction after day 3. If you have a second infarction after day 3, it is not possible to use troponin after 3 days, because after 3 days, troponin is still elevated up to the 7th day. You will be wondering whether it is a fresh infarction or it is an old infarction. When you have that doubt after 3 days, before 7 days, if the patient is complaining of a repeated chest pain, you can always consider CPK-MB. If CPK-MB rises again, that means there is a second infarction, right? Otherwise, by and large, we prefer troponin. Even troponin takes up to 3 hours to start rising. There are a few newer troponins which we call HS or high sensitivity troponin assays, which can become positive even before 3 hours. There are some troponins which might be detectable even after 1 to 2 hours. Okay, all said and done. Now imagine this gentleman comes to you in the emergency. Just like he did then, he came with angina, he came with ST elevation, and me and Rahul were having this big fight. Is it an ST elevation MI? Should we treat it as an ST elevation MI, or should we treat it as a infarction? That's a frank infarction. Is it an ischemia? Is it an infarction? We are fighting. And finally I said, look, if it is ST elevation myocardial infarction, it needs to have enzymes. So we go and we do the enzymes and we find that troponin is not elevated. Okay, it's been only 1 hour. Remember that the patient is having chest pain. We did the enzymes. You know that troponin is likely to be positive only after 3 hours, except if you do a high sensitive assay, maybe you can pick it up a little earlier. But since the troponin becomes positive only after 3 hours, we came back and we told him, okay, look, you have angina. You are probably having an acute coronary syndrome, but it is not stemming. So don't worry. It is not a myocardial infarction. We decided to do the test again after 2 hours. So we go and do the test after 2 hours. And do you know what will happen if you come back after 2 hours with the enzymes? Yes, Raghupati Raghav Rajaram, he will become No longer he is your patient. He will be carried away. Very important point. The cardiac biomarkers become positive only after 3 hours. That does not mean you should delay treatment. ST elevation MI is diagnosed on the basis of chest pain and ST elevation alone, not biomarkers. Biomarkers have a bigger role in NSTEMI management, also in confirming that you're dealing with an ST elevation, but in no way should your treatment for ST elevation MI be delayed because you don't have biomarkers. So, for all practical purposes, if your angina is lasting more than 15 minutes, if your angina is occurring at rest, it is not relieved by nitrates, that is, it looks like a vulnerable plaque rupture or an acute coronary syndrome. Clinically, acute coronary syndrome plus ST elevation, handle it as ST elevation MI. Okay, I repeat. Clinically acute coronary syndrome plus ST elevation on ECG, treat it as ST elevation MI. Do not wait for the biomarkers. Right? So, coming to that, acute coronary syndrome, instead of leaving the confusing name ST elevation MI, we can just call it ST elevation acute coronary syndrome. In fact, if you look at your new Harris and if you look at most of the newer guidelines, they will call it ST elevation acute coronary syndrome. Okay, you don't really need to fight over whether it is infarction or ischemia. I think just to avoid that fight, they decided to call it ST elevation acute coronary syndrome. So now let's discuss the components of ST elevation acute coronary syndrome. A very important part of ST elevation acute coronary syndrome is what you do in the emergency. And remember, this is not the cardiologist doing it. This is you. You as a house surgeon, okay, you as the intern, you as the physician, you as the first responder should know what to do in the emergency for acute coronary syndrome. You do not wait for the cardiologist. Okay? Somebody is going to come to you with clinical acute coronary syndrome. They're going to come to you with ST elevation. Manage it in the emergency. Why do you need the cardiologist then? The cardiologist usually does what is called the intervention part. He re-establishes perfusion using invasive or non-invasive techniques. Okay, so that is called reperfusion. Reperfusion. So this is where really the cardiologist comes. Otherwise, the first clinical responder, the first medical personnel who meets the patient should be able to treat ST elevation, and that is expected from you as a house surgeon. Third part is what you do after the reperfusion. So let us touch on each of this one by one. What will you as a first responder do in the emergency? In the emergency, your job is to limit the size of the infarct. How do you limit the size of the infarct? The first thing you know that it is ischemia. And in case of ischemia, there is hypoxia that is causing the necrosis. So what you should do is avoid hypoxia. And you avoid hypoxia by keeping the oxygen saturation more than 90. If the oxygen saturation is less than 90, start oxygen. Very simple. Okay, some people might go into heart failure because of the pulmonary edema, their saturation might be low. Start oxygen. Very simple thing you can do to reduce the infarct size. Number two, immediately, if you think about what happens after a vulnerable plaque rupture, the first thing that comes there is platelet. So you need to start antiplatelets. Antiplatelet therapy, the correct dose of antiplatelet. Okay. So the patient comes to you, you need to give an antiplatelet. Clinical diagnosis, you need to give an antiplatelet. You don't even need to wait for a ECG. So if you ask me, the person who was right, clearly I was wrong. I said do an ECG first. No need. If the patient has acute coronary syndrome, first give him aspirin. How much aspirin? Yes, the correct dosage of aspirin is 325 milligrams of aspirin. It is available as chewable tablets and it should be chewed because you want it being absorbed from the mouth, buccal absorption. It should not go to your stomach and get absorbed 2 hours later because you want immediate action. So you ask the patient to keep the aspirin in the mouth, chew it, keep it in the mouth so that it gets absorbed. 325 milligrams of aspirin, not your standard 75 milligram tablet, 325 milligram chewable tablets. Sometimes, especially in younger patients, you can add a second antiplatelet. Now, you know that aspirin works by inhibiting the cyclooxygenase enzyme irreversibly. So the platelets are not able to produce thromboxane. When you give 325, which is considered low dose of aspirin, it inhibits the platelet thromboxane A2 synthesis preferably. And that is what you start as far as aspirin is concerned. You can add a second antiplatelet, especially if there is a very little chance for bleed. So you have a younger patient who does not have any peptic ulcer, you can add one more antiplatelet, usually a P2Y12 platelet receptor blocker. Classic examples being Pasugrel, Ticagrelol and Clopidogrel. You can choose any of them. Clopidogrel is usually cheaper in India, about 300 milligrams you can give. Ticagrelol is considered the best among them. 180 milligrams is your loading dose. So this is what we usually call loading dose. Loading dose of aspirin is 325 milligram. Clopidogrel, which is much more commonly available, is 300 milligrams. Ticagrelol, 180 milligrams. When you're giving a P2Y12 inhibitor with a cyclooxygenase inhibitor, that is aspirin, you call it dual antiplatelet therapy. It is better than single antiplatelet therapy, especially in younger people who are unlikely to bleed. But if it is an older individual with a peptic ulcer disease, I would prefer not to give a P2Y12 inhibitor. The other thing that you can give is atorvastatin, a statin, 80 milligrams of atorvastatin. These are the two tablets that you should at least give. Add clopidogrel or ticagrelol to that if you feel it is justified. Atorvastatin is given because it stabilizes the plaque. It prevents the plaque from expanding. It prevents the plaque from producing a more florid thrombus. It restricts the thrombus to that area. It's called stabilizing the plaque. If somebody asks you, why do you give atorvastatin in acute coronary syndrome? Because you're not going to be able to bring the cholesterol levels down. No, that's not the idea. In the emergency, you give it because it is shown to stabilize the plaque. The third part of the therapy is to anti-ischemic therapy, that is to reduce demand. All of us know that the demand is primarily because of the contraction, right? You either reduce the demand or you increase the supply. So this will reduce the ischemia. The drugs that we classically use to reduce the ischemia, first is NTG or nitroglycerin. So that's a nitrate. It is a vasodilator, usually given sublingual. Okay, when you can give sublingual sorbitrate 5 milligrams, and what it does is vasodilation of the coronaries, increase the blood flow. So that increases the supply. It increases the supply. A second drug cardiologists use regularly is morphine. So morphine, you give it as 3 to 5 milligrams subcutaneous or even IV. You can give this. Morphine reduces pulmonary edema, it reduces pain, it reduces the sympathetic load on the patient, reduces heart rate. When the heart rate comes down, your demand also goes down. So NTG and morphine are two excellent drugs that should be tried in the emergency. Third is beta blockers. Usually we start beta blockers because they reduce the heart rate, reduce the oxygen demand. Initially intravenous beta blockers like metoprolol can be given multiple doses, and it can be then titrated to oral metoprolol. So remember, in the emergency, what you should be doing as a house surgeon or as an intern is, one, if the saturation is low, start oxygen because you can reduce the ischemia. Give aspirin 325 milligrams chewed. Give atorvastatin 80 milligrams. If it's a young patient unlikely to bleed, give ticagrelol, give clopidogrel, that is dual antiplatelet therapy, DAPT. In order to reduce the ischemia, morphine, sublingual nitrates, IV beta blockers can be used, and these are things that you should know how to use in the emergency. Ultimately, the management of ST elevation acute coronary syndrome hinges on reperfusion. Reperfusion means re-establishing the circulation. Re-establishing the circulation in the blocked coronary. There are three ways you can do this. One is called percutaneous. Via the skin, you put a catheter into the coronary and open it up. It is what we call balloon angioplasty, or the technical term is percutaneous coronary intervention, PCI. This is the best procedure to be used in an acute coronary syndrome. The second technique, when PCI is not available, you can break down the clot by using fibrinolysis. We'll come to that. And a technique that is rarely used, especially if PCI is not possible, is coronary artery bypass graft, something an American will call cabbage. Right? We'll see that as well. Now, whom do you take for reperfusion? In STEMI, we do a reperfusion if there is ST elevation in two contiguous leads. Contiguous meaning next to each other. Okay? So remember, lead 1, lead V1 and V2 are contiguous. They are next to each other. Lead 1 and lead 2 are not next to each other. Lead 1 is looking at your left ventricle. Lead 2 is actually looking at the inferior surface of the heart. So they are not really contiguous. 2, 3 AVF are contiguous because they are looking at the inferior surface of the heart. Lead 1 is contiguous with AVL as they are looking at the lateral surface of the heart. So 2 nearby leads. In 2 nearby leads, you should have an ST elevation. How much? In case of chest leads, you require at least 2 mm. In case of limb leads, 1 mm is enough. The reason, limb leads are far away from the chest, so the deflection of the ST deflection is usually lesser. So let me reiterate. Reperfusion should be done if there is ST elevation in 2 contiguous leads, that having 2 mm elevation in the chest leads or at least 1 mm elevation in 2 contiguous limb leads. Right? So how do you do the reperfusion? Percutaneous coronary intervention is done under radiographic guidance. So the patient is taken to what is called a fluoroscopy room. So under a C-arm, which is also used to localize broken bones by an orthopedician, the same way you do it in what is called a fluoroscopy or an angiography room. The patient is catheterized. That is, a catheter is introduced either through the femoral artery, radial artery, and then that catheter is threaded all the way into the aorta. At the root of the aorta, you have the origin of the coronaries. You can thread the catheter into either of the coronary. How do you know which coronary? Of course, you have the ECG to guide you, right? You know the inferior leads, you know the lateral leads, you know the anterior leads. That tells you where to put your catheter. Once you put your catheter, you inject a radio-opaque dye. You inject a radio-opaque dye into your coronaries. So here you can see left anterior descending, left circumflex, you can see, as well as the smaller arteries. So you can see all the epicardial coronary vessels on the angiography. It tells you if there is a block or not. If there is no blood flowing beyond this area, it is said to be blocked. So then you did a fluoroscopy, you did an angiography, and finally you do the intervention, which is what we call percutaneous coronary intervention. The catheter has usually a balloon at the end of the catheter. This catheter is threaded past the obstruction and the balloon is inflated and deflated multiple times. By inflating and deflating the balloon multiple times, you will be able to open up the occluded vessel. Once the occluded coronary is opened, a stent is placed to prevent re-occlusion, right? So this is the technique of percutaneous coronary intervention. And when do you decide it is enough? There is a group of medical professionals and scientists who study angiographic management of these patients. And the group is called TIMI, standing for thrombolysis in myocardial infarction. And this group has proposed 4 grades of coronary flow. TIMI grade 0 flow is when the contrast does not pass this obstruction. So here you can see that there is a vulnerable plaque rupture and a complete block. The dye is not crossing beyond that obstruction. So TIMI grade 0 flow is complete occlusion of the artery. TIMI grade 1 flow is when a little bit of dye goes past, but it is not reaching the distal areas. Some contrast passes beyond the obstruction, but it is not reaching the distal parts of the coronaries. TIMI grade 2 is when it is reaching the distal part of the coronaries, but it's not flowing very smoothly. That is, it's got sluggish flow. TIMI grade 4 is when the perfusion is fast, there is full perfusion, the flow is not sluggish. This is TIMI grade 3. Why do we even need to know these grades? Because studies have been done on the basis of TIMI grades of flow, and it has been shown that if you can cause TIMI grade 3, if you can open up the artery and get TIMI grade 3 flow, that is full perfusion of even the distal bed at a good speed, the mortality comes down. Mortality is something like 2% once you achieve TIMI grade 3 flow. If you do not treat that patient, the mortality is about 6%. Right? This is a very important parameter to understand. You are able to bring down deaths due to ST elevation MI by at least 200, at least you're by 2/3. You're able to reduce the risk of death by 2/3 by opening up the vessel. And how do you know the vessel is adequately opened up? You need TIMI grade 3 flow. So now we say that the aim of reperfusion is to achieve TIMI grade 3 flow. When you achieve TIMI grade 3 flow, the cardiologist will be happy that he has completed reperfusion. Now, it is not enough to achieve TIMI grade 3 flow because your idea is to save muscle. Remember, the longer the muscle is ischemic, the more muscle gets damaged, the more likely patient is going towards heart failure. Time is muscle. The longer you wait, the more myocardium is damaged. So how do you prevent that? You need to act fast. How fast? Again, we have to go to studies and trials to see how fast we should act. If you can see this large study which is done by the TIMI group itself, you can see that the mortality can be reduced to 2% by achieving TIMI grade 3 flow. So the idea is to achieve TIMI grade 3 flow by doing something called primary PCI. Primary PCI, the first treatment that you're going to give the patient is PCI. Okay, earlier there was this concept that you first do fibrinolysis, then do PCI, something called a facilitated PCI. Or if your fibrinolysis is not working, then do the PCI, something called rescue PCI. Now all of those have been shown to be obsolete. The best way to reduce mortality is to directly take the patient for a PCI and open up the coronary. So does it matter when you open up the coronary? Yes, it does. As this graph shows you, the mortality is around 2% if you do it within the first 15 minutes. Up to 13 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, 75 minutes, around 90 minutes mark. That is, after the patient comes and meets the medical responder. Okay, first medical contact. Patient comes in and meets the first nurse or the doctor. Within 90 minutes, if you can open up the coronary, your mortality remains around 2%. If you go beyond 90 minutes, you can see that the mortality starts increasing. So after 24 hours, the mortality doesn't seem to really come down. In fact, it seems to be worse if you wait that long. So the standard of care or the way to manage ST elevation acute coronary syndromes is to do a primary PCI, that is directly go for a PCI, achieve TIMI grade 3 flow and do it within 90 minutes of meeting the first medical contact. So we will say standard of care in ST elevation ACS is do a primary PCI to achieve TIMI grade 3 flow with a first medical contact to balloon time. Balloon, that is the time when we expand the balloon and open up the coronary. It should be less than 90 minutes. Okay, so remember this point, very, very important. This is our aim of reperfusion, right? So once this is done, we'll see about the post-reperfusion therapy, but I'll just pass a small glance at what are the other mechanisms of reperfusion. You know that we can also use fibrinolysis and CABG or CABG for reperfusion. Fibrinolysis works by using certain enzymes which are called tissue plasminogen activators like streptokinase or alteplase or retiplase. Now these, what they do is they activate plasminogen, which is an enzyme which is present in the endothelium of our cells. Tissue plasminogen activators activate plasminogen to plasmin. And once plasmin is activated, we know that plasmin breaks down the fibrin mesh of the thrombus to fibrin degradation products. What it does is it technically dissolves the thrombus. It dissolves the thrombus. Now, whom do we do fibrinolysis in? Fibrinolysis, the problem with it is we really don't get an idea what TIMI flow we have achieved. It's a blind procedure. I'm just injecting it intravenously. It goes through, it dissolves the clot. I really don't know, right? So one of the problems with fibrinolysis is that I don't know if it is effective or not completely. I don't know the TIMI grade of flow, right? The other problem with fibrinolysis is that fibrinolysis has complications and it takes time. Okay, before we come to the complications, fibrinolysis usually takes much longer time. So when you give it, usually it takes about an hour to dissolve the clot, even when it does. So unlike the balloon which opens the clot immediately or the block immediately, fibrinolysis takes another 60 minutes to do that. So you can open using a balloon, a PCI, within 90 minutes without increasing mortality. However, when it comes to fibrinolysis, you have to do it within 30 minutes because the drug itself takes 60 minutes to act, right? So you don't have 90 minutes, but what you have is 90 minus 60, which is 30 minutes. Within the patient coming in through the door, to the time you put in a needle and start fibrinolysis, you can only give 30 minutes, right? Otherwise, beyond that time, fibrinolysis doesn't seem to have a great deal of benefit over no treatment. So generally we say that we do fibrinolysis. It's not the best modality of treatment. PCI is always the best. We say that we do fibrinolysis only if the patient is very far away from a PCI enabled center. See the difference? This is given intravenously. The other one, we need an angiography room. We need fluoroscopy. We need a trained cardiologist. We need availability of catheter. All those things are not needed in fibrinolysis. If your patient comes to you with ST elevation, acute coronary syndrome in the periphery hospitals where you don't have an angiography, where you don't have a PCI enabled center, and the patient is going to take more than 2 hours to reach there, then it is as well that you give fibrinolysis, right? The complications of fibrinolysis that I alluded to were hemorrhage because it breaks clots. It can produce bleeds, especially inside the brain, intracranial, or in the GI tract. About 1% of the people do develop serious hemorrhage. Allergic reactions because it is a protein, it's an enzyme, streptokinase. It can also produce allergic reactions in about 2%, right? So there are some people who we just do not do fibrinolysis. These are those people who already have internal bleed, like a peptic ulcer bleed. It is just going to worsen. Anybody who had a bleed, a CNS, a hemorrhagic stroke in the past, even ischemic strokes in the past 3 months, we will be very wary because they have increased risk of bleeding. Any known intracranial tumor patient, you should avoid giving fibrinolysis, that is streptokinase or tissue plasminogen activators. In patients having very high blood pressure, which you are not able to bring below 180 by 110, do not do fibrinolysis because the chance of bleed is very, very high. If you think the patient has a suspected aortic dissection, younger patient, Marfan's coming to you with a pain that is radiating to the back, do an echo, rule out aortic dissection before you think about fibrinolysis, right? So these are some of the absolute contraindications which should be in the back of your mind before you plan to do fibrinolysis in any patient. Lastly, there is coronary artery bypass graft. Coronary artery bypass graft is not usually preferred as a management of acute coronary syndrome because naturally it is a surgical procedure and takes a bit of time. Even in the hands of experts, it does take a little bit of time to do it. It many a times requires the patient to be put on a heart-lung bypass machine, and there are a lot of complications in the surgery. So because of that, we would either prefer to go for, right, the percutaneous coronary intervention or fibrinolysis when it is not available. However, in very select areas where the stenosis is very tight and it is not opening up, you can go for a CABG or CABG. It usually uses an internal mammary artery as a graft. So if you have a block over here, you bypass it by using this artery, which is grafted from your chest wall, or you can use the saphenous vein if you have a block which is usually grafted from the leg. So this is another way of attaining reperfusion. however less preferable to PCI or fibrinolysis. Let's finally come to what is called a post-reperfusion care. That is, after doing the reperfusion, the patient should be continued on treatment. So this happens in the ICU after reperfusion. After your PCI, you take the patient to the ICU, or more specifically, what is called a coronary care unit or a CCU. Why should these patients be monitored? Because many of them have complications like heart failure, like arrhythmias. So they need monitoring. They need continuing treatment. One part of the treatment is to continue antiplatelet therapy. Aspirin, you had given 325 milligrams in the emergency. Now continue 75 milligrams per day. This is continued lifelong. In patients who, even after their stents, many patients are continued on dual antiplatelet therapy, ticagrelor or clopidogrel. Usually clopidogrel is continued for about 3 months to a year in most patients who have stents in place. IV triple antiplatelet therapy using GP2B3A inhibitors. These are rarely used. They are used in patients who have very tight stenosis, which was opened with some difficulty, and the cardiologist during angiography realizes this patient can have another thrombus within the stent itself. In such patients, they might have for a few days be given this third type of antiplatelet, which is called triple antiplatelet. So remember, most patients we would only give dual antiplatelet therapy. The anti-ischemic therapy should continue even in the CCU, that is the nitrates, beta blockers, morphines. The patient should not have any angina while the patient is in your ICU. In certain patients, you might have to start anticoagulant therapy. As we had discussed, there are certain patients who are at high risk for developing thrombus within the ventricle or in the atrium after the MI, and these are patients who are likely to develop strokes. So this includes patients who have anterior wall MI producing sluggish contraction of the left ventricle, or those patients who are having atrial fibrillation. Those patients who already have LV thrombus within the heart on echocardiography or have already suffered an embolism naturally should be put on anticoagulant therapy. Short-term anticoagulant therapy is usually using unfractionated heparin, or more better, nowadays we usually use low molecular weight heparin because we do not need to monitor the APTT. Right? So any patient who is having anterior wall MI, atrial fibrillation, or presence of a left ventricular thrombus or embolism, go ahead and anticoagulate the patient. Long term, in order to avoid heart failure, we use cardiac remodeling, anti-cardiac remodeling drugs, These include beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists. What they do is prevent the heart from going into heart failure in the long term. Okay, the details we will discuss in our heart failure sessions, but remember, these three are the group of drugs that you will use for preventing long-term heart failure in any patient who has heart disease. Okay. Usually, patients after acute coronary syndrome can be mobilized in 1 to 2 days. They can be discharged in 5 to 7 days after a PCI. They return to regular activity within a month. Okay. You advise lifestyle modification, exercise and diet, and smoking cessation throughout. Remember, this is a teachable moment where you can tell the patient to change certain parts of his lifestyle. Okay. Drugs, that is antiplatelets, statins, anti-remodeling drugs will continue.